G'day, I've got Robin Hanson with us today. Robin's an economist at George Mason University. I think he founded the Dagger project as well as the SciCast project. We're going to be talking about both of those, and we're going to be talking about Future Day, which is March 1st. Robin, yes, would you like to first give us a brief introduction so our viewers know who you are and your relationship with future forecasting?
Hi, my name is Robin Hanson. I'm a professor of economics at George Mason University. I've focused a lot of my research career on something called prediction markets, which are basically betting markets for forecasting. They're usually applied to near-term forecasts, so a business is trying to forecast whether projects will complete or what sales will be. And they can be applied to decision making, which I think is an especially useful application, asking for the forecast of what would happen if we did something. So I think there's huge potential for prediction markets to reform decision making and management in many contexts and governance. They can be applied to longer term forecasts, so they can be applied to the more distant future. And we can talk about their potential for application there and what's better and worse about that. In addition, I have a side research agenda for many years thinking about the social implications of particular future technologies. There are many sort of hard-nosed tech futurists who know about particular technologies and forecast what future technology is likely to be, and often that's motivated by trying to imagine their social consequences, but usually those people don't really know much social science. And I think there's an opening for people who know social science to take those tech forecasts seriously, and then try to apply their social science to figure out what's likely to actually happen.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. So, I mean, what is it? Why near term? I mean, it seems like near term is probably a lot easier to predict. But what have you found has been the difficulties in long term forecasting, and
Well,
why you gravitate towards near term?
there's two separate sets of issues.
Yeah.
We're developing a new technology, and for any one technology, there's issues in using it, and there's issues in testing it. So, if you're trying to show that something works or try variations to see what works best, you want a short product cycle, a short feedback cycle. So, independent of the value you might get of using it on longer term things, you might like to test it and develop it on shorter term questions so that you can go through many cycles. So, since we're in a product development, testing, innovation mode, in that mode we'd like to focus on shorter term topics so that we can find out what works. Longer term questions, obviously, they aren't as good for testing, but they still could be good for use. So, if you wanted to find out the answer to a long term question, a prediction market might still be a good method. While it's true that holding constant the method and varying the question, the longer term your question, the harder it is to give people good incentives to answer your question well. That is, if you're going to entice them to give you good answers to a question based on giving them some sort of feedback or incentives, that is, if they do well, you'll reward them, and if they do poorly, you won't reward them as much. The longer term question, it just becomes harder to give them those feedback because you'll have to wait longer before you find out, and then the feedback will be delayed, and that makes it weaker. So that's true of all mechanisms, though, for dealing with future forecasting. So it doesn't make this mechanism worse than any other mechanism. It just means that it's just harder in general to get people to give accurate forecasts for long-term questions.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay.
so,
Yeah. You were going to say something before I
So,
started.
so if you look in the newspaper and, you see pundits who will noticeably take a different attitude toward forecasting what will happen next week or next month from what will forecast 10 years or 20 years. They roughly know that in a week or a month, their forecast will be found out to be true or false, and they'll have to spin it and deal with that, and that makes them more cautious about that. But if they make a forecast that's 10 or 20 years out, they know that people will hardly remember what they said, and if so, hardly give them any consequences, so they feel more free to ignore the consequences of that inaccurate predictions and making longer term forecasts.
Mm. I guess it's important, like with a lot of our projects that that some of the most important projects are projects that are going to span longer than the average financial time horizon, like 2 or 3 years. It's not all that long. We're
Right.
looking at like I guess improving energy sources,
Sure.
and how to colonize space and how to build supercomputers that can parallel human brain power,
Right.
yeah, and all those sorts of things. Really long-term projects that possibly need also like infrastructure,
Sure.
town planning, and all those sorts of things.
So we can distinguish a number of different timescales
Mm.
to analyze the situation, right? So there's a timescale over which things change, and then if you try to forecast past the timescale over which most things change, you just run into the combinatorial problem of so many things change, it's hard to know what's likely to happen.
Hmm.
So there's one timescale, the timescale over which basically everything changes, that makes it hard to forecast that point. Then
Yeah.
there's another timescale over which we care. And if you think you might care about your life and maybe somewhat about your children, but hardly at all about your grandchildren, that creates a limitation about getting people to care, because there's a time scale over which they care up to a point, and beyond that they don't care.
Mm.
Then, and additionally, there are time scales of, say, financial return, and then it's hard to get a, say, financial investor or a business interested in things that might happen beyond the timescale of their financial return. So if investments, say, double every 10 years or 15 years, then if there's five doublings out, they're just relatively uninterested in what might happen then, because it's just not going to make very much difference to their investment. And then there's the timescale over which people can get career rewards or punishments or gains by making forecasts.
Hmm.
And so it might be hard to entice people to do something on the basis of it helping their later career if the time scale is past the end of their career.
Hmm. Right.
So those are all a bunch of different time scales, and they each affect different kinds of forecasts and different kinds of incentives for forecasts.
So these incentives, these preferences people have about the useful forecasts, are often dictated by financial time horizons or personal time horizons. But I'm kind of in like conflicted. I mean, it's important to satisfy people's preferences in the short term, but I mean, as somebody who
Well,
tries to think about the long term a lot, I think that it is really important that we think about the world as it may exist outside of my
sure.
lifetime.
Well, I mean, by any straightforward objective standards, future people matter, and they matter as much as present people. So
Right.
if you're trying to weigh all people equally in some broad sense, then you should give a lot of weight to these future people.
Hmm.
That's what you should do. But of course, there's the problem that you might not actually do what you should.
Hmm.
Each of us might be selfish. And of course, all of the groups that we're involved with are all groups now. They aren't groups that spread across the future that much necessarily. So we might be concerned that we'd be hypocritical, that we would pretend to speak for the future and be the voice of defending their interests, but we might actually be just speaking for ourselves now. It might give us a certain aura of respectability, or we might find we might like the look of the angel wings and the halo that we get for thinking that we're talking about the future. But we should hold ourselves to a little skepticism and ask, for some evidence that we're actually paying attention to the future, as opposed to just using it as an indirect way to talk about ourselves now.
Right. Okay. So, would you then approach discounting, putting some discount based on some measurement of self-interest in forecasting, or
Well,
would you take
I
another
don't.
approach?
It's a skepticism. So as you know, when people can't be checked, you concern that they might take that freedom and be sloppy with it. So you'll want to be a little more careful in watching and listening for and noticing clues that they are being sloppy,
Mm.
because they could get away with it.
Hmm.
When somebody can't get away with being sloppy, then you less have to pay attention for that.
Well, just let's just say some dude who doesn't really think about the long-term future stumbled upon this video and he needed to be convinced that it's worth thinking long-term. What would you say to him if it was just Joe Sixpack, who
Well,
owned an automotive company or something like that? Right?
you might say. if you actually care about everybody everywhere all the time, then most of the people are going to be later, so you should care about them. If you say no, I don't care about everybody everywhere all the time. I care about me and my family. Then you might say, well, do you have kids? Do you plan on having kids? Will they have kids? Will those kids have kids? Well, if you care about your kids, then you got to care about the future because that's the world they'll live in. You may not care about your kids or your kids' in which case you just may care about you. Then you might say, well, would you like to live a long time? It might actually be possible. And if you'd like to live a long time, then you should be looking into some possibilities. And then, of course, if you do live a long time, you'll be living in the future because that's what it means to live a long time.
Hmm. And that's also going to maximize your gene sort of output in the long term, right? I mean, it's a biological drive
Yeah.
that we have.
Right. So, well, it's not clear how conscious you are, but if you think of you
Yes.
and your kind, and often people are more motivated to be against something or to resist something that's against them than be for something. You could say there are forces out there that would like to exterminate you and your kind. They would like to wipe out all creatures like you and replace them with creatures like them. Are you going to let them, or are you going to resist and stand up for your kind? And if you are, then you have to think about your kind over the long run and what forces are trying to wipe out your kind, and realize that you'll have to take a long-term view to defend and promote your kind.
Hmm.
And many people are more motivated by defending their kind against the others who want to exterminate them
Hmm.
than they might be to think about their own lives or their children's lives or just the fact that people will live in the future and care about themselves.
We know that society has definitely helped us to deal with more and more people. I mean, we can sort of interact and sort of usefully integrate with more than 150 people. So this is going beyond our sort of innate biology to we're using shared fictions, we're using societal frameworks to be able to increase the amount of people that can work together. So we've sort of widened the amount of people who are working on projects to better life.
Right.
But you mentioned sociologists before. How could sociologists then use long-term predictions to improve society for the long term, not only just improving the short term?
Um, I guess, I mean, first of all, we make choices that affect the future.
Sure.
And so the way that we could improve the future is to make better choices
Mm.
that will more benefit the future.
Mm.
Um, and most of the ways in which people are affected by technology choices certainly is through how technology changes society. That is, most people fundamentally care about the society around them and their social relations, and technology and other contexts is mostly relevant as it affects those relations. So, at least once you're not starving or shivering in the cold. So, um, you'll want if you want future people to not starve or not shiver in the cold or not be lonely or to feel fulfilled or to enjoy their company, you'll want to wonder how various things that might happen, that things we might do, will influence and change the world they live in, most of which is social,
Hmm.
in order to have them have a nice world or not a bad one. I mean, the path you should think is we make choices today, and those choices affect things today. They affect which businesses are formed, which technologies are developed, and which products are distributed. They affect which institutions we're in, what nations we have, what companies we're in, what cities we have. They affect our social habits of marriage and having children and clubs and churches. And all of those things have dynamics that persist into the future. And then you have to think about those dynamics, how those things affect each other to produce future churches and firms and marriages and, dinners, to imagine what the future world is going to be like so that you can then make a connection between the actions you make today and the dynamics of how things change to result in a world that has all these things in it and decide which elements of those worlds you think would be good.
Hmm. Decide which elements of those worlds you think would be good. Now, as a transhumanist or somebody who's interested in improving society in the future, maybe a little bit of a utopian in me thinks that it's possible to make it a hell of
Yeah.
a lot better than it is now. A lot of people are just really interested in I guess, perpetuating the status quo. And maybe some people aren't really aware of the potentials for some technologies on the horizon to really improve life, to decrease disease, to extend life, to give us more
Okay.
access to.
So let's break it down by the kinds of categories
Mm,
of, different ways the future society could be in terms of how we might affect them. So,
mm,
one very straightforward thing is there might be more or less future people.
mm,
So, all else equal, if more people are good, and then we might affect how many of them there are. Then, of course, we might affect for each one of them sort of average wealth levels. We could affect their health and their consumption and their leisure and the range of entertainment options they have available to them and the range of travel options and all of those sorts of straightforward mechanical material goods we can affect that the future could vary in terms of how rich it is and how interconnected it is and how peaceful it is. For example, they could be at war and destroying each other, and that could be bad. We could also affect. We could also imagine the future would vary in terms of the social groupings they have. Will there be large families or small? Will they be married or single? Will they be in groups like churches, or will they be more individual? Will they be in large firms or small, big nations or small? Will these groupings they're in be strong bonds where they feel a tight bond and a strong connection and have demand a lot of each other? Or will they be loose associations with a lot of discretion and freedom? Um, and those are all different possibilities, ranges of possibilities. And many of the actions that we might take to affect the future will affect these possibilities. So some of the things we do will just make the world like bigger, more richer. Like it'll affect how many people there are and how rich they are. So the more that we each work hard and build capital that's useful in the future, the more that we innovate and develop in technologies and other practices that are useful in the future, the more we expand the range of possibilities in the future. But then it'll also influence actions that are sticky, that are hard to change. That is, once a lot of people are all together in a particular place as a city, it's hard to move the city.
mm.
So where we choose to live will influence where future cities are. And if we move to smaller towns, then the future may have more smaller towns. If we move to a bigger city, the future may have bigger cities. And that also applies for religions or firms. The future might have lots of small firms or a few big firms, um, lots of small nations, a few big nations, and so the actions we take today then have momentum and stickiness such that the future will find it, you know, easiest to stay near whatever we're doing now. This is also true for many standards. Like so if we continue to speak English more, say, then the world will tend to speak more English. If we can use Windows products and Microsoft, then the future operating systems will be like Microsoft. And right, there's all these standards and conventions that, as we adopt them, the future will find it's an interest to stay near them. And so we influence the future by the standards we adopt, the conventions we adopt, the languages we speak, etc. Um,
What about the
and that all
philosophies that we share? I mean, a
well
lot.
often those philosophies are like standards. So in a sense, you might think there's a bunch of religions in the world,
Mm,
and when people join a religion, they make it easier for future people to join that religion.
mm,
And people tend to choose among the religions that are around when they're choosing. And so the attitudes are sort of packages of lifestyles, and the packages of attitudes are also things that, as we choose them, will make it easier for future people to choose them
mm,
and harder for them to choose something else.
mm. So we live in a world with conflicting ideologies. I mean, we have some parts of the world find great virtue in their religion or their philosophy, and will do amazing things to uphold the virtueness, the purity of their religion, and try and kill anybody who doesn't sort of agree, or,
Right.
or who shames their messiah or whatnot. And then we have other people who just really just want to work according to rules, deontological style thinking. That might be divine command, or it might just be, okay, this is the way society should function, and we just need laws or rules. Would you consider yourself a utilitarianist of some description?
Um, I'm, I guess, an economist, and the standard analysis tool in economics is called welfare economics, which tends to be a form of what's called preference utilitarianism.
Okay, yep.
And
I
so I
use.
find that a very acceptable framework to do analysis of what's good or bad.
Mm.
Um, and so, but that's in part, it's a convenient tool to be part of a larger community where we can use the same standard of analysis and then communicate to each other. And it's also a reasonable standard from the point of view of what's called the Pareto criterion of trying to make things so that everybody basically better off from their own point of view.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I don't consider that a very abstract principled
Mm-hmm.
commitment to a religion or something. I consider that as a more practical consideration.
Just a quick aside down the utilitarian route. Well, there's a problem with I guess a thought experiment that if you have so many people and you want to equalize the distribution of happiness, the more people you add, should you add people to, in order to increase the amount of happiness, should you be adding people to, like lots of people to the population? And if so, maybe we end up at the repugnant conclusion.
Yeah, I never found the repugnant conclusion especially repugnant myself,
Hmm.
but but clearly, I mean, I think you have to find some zero reference, and even if it's arbitrary, you have to judge and pick it. That is, when you add a new life, you have to judge if it's better than no life. And
Mm.
it's certainly possible that a life will be so bad that the we and the creature themselves might rather they never existed.
Mm.
Our lives usually aren't that way, and most of the people we know we don't think of as that way, but it's certainly possible.
Mm.
But within the realm of quality of life, such that they don't regret existing, and then they would like to exist longer if they could, and we don't regret their existing, and we think it looks like a value, then within that range, it looks like more is better,
Mm.
all else equal. Obviously, there would be a trade-off between having more creatures, each of whom are less satisfied, um, but
Well,
again,
that is the
I tend to
trade-off, isn't it? I mean, like, if you have like 100,000 people who are happy at point, have I guess 100 hedonistic points each, and then like if you times that by 100, you have to divide all the possible hedonistic points among
right.
the all the new people, and then everybody, although there's more people, everybody's
So that's
only
an
happy
issue
at
for
hedonistic point one.
the hedonistic utilitarian. We'll have to take that issue.
Mm.
Being more of a preference
Yes.
utilitarian, I more just have to ask who wants what,
Who wants to
and
be happy?
right, or who wants to exist.
Yes.
And as a sort of economist, I would more tend to think in terms of, well, what creatures could pay for their existence? Um, that is,
The AIs.
perhaps, but in a standard economic analysis, if you can exist and pay for your existence, then basically you can pay other people to appreciate your existence. That is, by paying them for the material resources that you require and the other things that you displace, you make them better off while you make yourself better off by existing, and there's not a conflict. So it would only be creatures, in a sense, who can't pay for their existence, for whom there's a issue of whether it would be worth taking away from others to pay for them to exist.
Hmm.
But I tend to imagine futures more in which people, all the creatures who exist, can pay for their existence. They are not only enjoying their own lives, they are adding to the lives of others in a
Hmm.
way that makes it a net win for all.
Just quickly, it seems a lot of people are worried about the future of work, and if we make agents, if we're interested in our own life and our own sort of ability to survive, and we need an income to do so, the more and more automation, the less and less opportunities there are for jobs, and the more and more unemployment there may be. If this, I don't know how far we could take this into the future. If like we have AIs that are just intrinsically going to be smarter, more able, and more capable than we are on every front, then will that mean the end of human existence?
Well, I mean, there's a short term and a long term. So
Mm.
obviously, in the short term, over the last few centuries, we've had plenty of improvement in jobs and automation, and that certainly has often cut people out of particular jobs. But there's
Mm.
usually been plenty of other things for people to do. So overall, people have gotten more valuable,
Mm.
and automation has not threatened jobs or human livelihood. But in the long run, if you have machines that can replace humans and be better at them at pretty much all jobs, then humans lose their ability to pay for their existence. That is, they can't work and get and produce more than their competitors and justify their existence on that basis. Um, but a lot depends on what kind of machines these are. So um, if they are descendants of humans, if they are, for example, brain emulations, if they are, you take a human and you scan them and you put them in a machine and it wakes up and it remembers being human, but now it's a machine, then such a thing can be more straightforwardly thought of as a descendant of a human. And you might think that that's a noble, worthy descendant, and the loss of humans to be replaced by those things might not be such a bad thing. So you could make the analogy in our past, say, where foragers were displaced by farmers, and farmers were displaced by we now who live in industry, and you might say, well, the foragers almost all went extinct. That is, there are hardly any foragers left, but the farmers were direct descendants of the foragers, and that might be thought of as a worthy descendant, and it was valuable and good that the transition happened. Or you might think that the world is having fewer and fewer subsistence farmers these days. They are being replaced by people who live in cities and people who work in industrial economies. And you might think that's not the extinctions of the farmers, that's the transformation of the farmers to become industry. Similarly, you might think, well, in some literal sense, humans might go away, but if their descendants prosper and spread, is that such a bad thing?
Yeah, but I mean, as society today is very different from the society that displaced foragers, for instance. I mean, we've developed values in society that probably weren't very loud. They didn't have much amplitude back then, like
That's right. Yeah.
welfare, for instance. So,
Well,
if
foragers actually had a lot of welfare in the sense that forager bands were really egalitarian, and
yeah,
they did a lot of helping each other out. But
right,
farmers were much less so.
yes, yeah,
But certainly the general point is true that these different eras of humans have been substantially different and had substantially different values. That is, they had different lifestyles, they had different habits of living, they had different things they knew, they had different things that were central to them, and we, in many ways, are feel somewhat alienated from and distant from our ancestors, and they might well feel that way relative to us. And it's not obvious that they would think of us as completely worthy descendants. They might be upset and disturbed by many of the ways we have rejected what was central to them.
hmm
And perhaps if they could have prevented us from existing, if the foragers could have preserved a world of foragers, preventing farming and industry from happening, or the farmers could have prevented industry from occurring, then some of them may have wanted to do that. And so, we should certainly ask ourselves whether we like what we see when we imagine our descendants and the way they're most likely to be. And if we are repelled enough by that, we might think of going to extremes to prevent it. But of course, it would be a very strong tide we'd be working against. It would have been really quite an effort for foragers to prevent farming from happening, or farming to prevent industry from happening. There would have been very large costs to pay in, ubiquitous monitoring and strong rules and drastic draconian punishments in order to squash any small attempt for slipping into the farming world or the industry world, if they had really thought it was as an evil that was worth such vigorous prevention. But
and the
we
technologies to keep people in check, the policing technologies, the surveillance technologies, may not have actually been really feasible in a foraging economy.
Right, they might have, but you could imagine them having the strong religious attitudes that anybody who stays in one place and digs in the ground rather than wandering was, just kill them anytime you see them, and you're just horrified, and you have a trigger strategy. Anything that even looks like that, you wipe them out for fear that you might not prevent it. And
Hey, there's
similarly, you
some
could have.
kid digging a hole. Get him.
Right. Well, I mean, that's what it takes to have
Right.
such a draconian thing. And similarly, in the future, if you wanted to say brain emulations would be so horrifying that we just must prevent them, then you'll have to be vigorously pursuing every little corner where they might be appearing so that you can squash them, and to make sure it doesn't happen, because the tide of history is such a strong force that you're trying to resist.
Mm.
Not to say that it isn't possible, and if it isn't important enough, you should, but
Mm.
you just have to realize what's at stake.
Mm. Well, we have taken a very interesting but long meander into what's possible in the future, but we were going to cover some points like about your projects at like
Right?
Dagger and SciCast. First, you wanted to describe what Dagger is, and then after we'll move on to SciCast after we've just finished discussing that.
Well, I can describe them together. Dagger and SciCast are both research projects
Yep,
funded by IARPA, which is a U.S. government research funding agency.
yep.
And they are intended to develop the state of the art in prediction market technology.
Mm.
So each of them is being applied to a particular set of questions with actual participants involved in forecasting so that we can see how these technologies work out when they're actually applied to particular topics. But their main purpose is not so much to answer those questions that are in the market as to develop the technology. And so our focus from the beginning of both projects has been on combinatorial prediction market technology. So if you think about an ordinary, say, betting market on a horse's race or things like that, you have each horse and how well he does in the race, or you have each candidate and which how he's going to do in the election. But there is a whole combinatorial space of all the different combinations of which candidates will win, or which horses will win race, or which things will happen.
Mm-hmm.
And in the language of probability theory, the general belief you might have is what's called a joint probability distribution, a probability distribution over all possible combinations. And usually there's a vast exponential space of those combinations. And usually in decision theory, you are weighing your beliefs in that vast combinatorial space when you're analyzing what's the best choice. And so when you get these small sort of partial beliefs, like what's the chance of some horse winning the race or a candidate winning the election, you're only getting a very small fraction of all the different beliefs you might have about that and that are relevant. And so the combinatorial prediction technology is a way to let users more cheaply explore and express this larger space of beliefs. So they can take any one questions and they can say, let me assume some answers to this question, and then go express answers to other questions. And by doing so, they end up expressing conditional probabilities and conditional estimates. And through all of many different making assumptions and making estimates, our users will fill out a joint probability distribution over events. And that will allow a much richer sort of description of what's likely to happen.
Mm.
So if we applied that to, say, futurism,
Mm.
we could not just get the probability of an AI by a date or a moon colony by a date or the probability of Bitcoin, having some gadgets, but we can start to get the relationships between these events. If Bitcoin is successful, does that increase the chance of AIs by a certain date? Or if nanotechnology is developed, does that make wars more likely? Or we get this full set of relationships between events. And that's been the main initial technological hurdle. Doing so requires a lot of computer science developments because basically there's this much larger space of possibilities than you can actually fit in the computer. So we have to be clever about expressing and representing this larger space of possibilities so that a computer can hold it.
Mm.
So, but if you go to the SciCast.org website, you'll see our current site, and it's actually a nice user interface, and you'll see all sorts of science and technology questions. And we used to have a site called Dagger, which was on foreign affairs and foreign events, and that site no longer is active. But it was forecasting, what was happening in Egypt and what was happening in Europe with the financial crisis, et cetera. And that the Dagger project was part of a set of parallel projects, so that each different group had a different research focus, but they weren't supposed to all be forecasting the same things at the same time, so that overall we could track how different methods differed in how they forecasted things. And now our SciCast project is split off from that. That's been focused on a particular team called the Good Judgment Team.
Mm-hmm.
And they're continuing to forecast foreign affairs and foreign events, but we're now forecasting science and technology questions. And we solicit your participations to come answer the questions we have there and to add more questions
Mm-hmm.
about science and technology forecasts. So if there's something you want to know about what's likely to happen, and you can define a specific question in terms of like how to judge it, then please come and contribute your questions.
Definitely, and the URL will be in the description here in the video. So, what sorts of questions have you got? Some examples and the time horizons you're looking at?
Well, we've got, say, supercomputing power. So we have some horizons out into the future of how powerful supercomputers will be, how much, how much power per chip and how much power per watt and things like that. So you can do long-term forecasting of computer abilities. Will Moore's law peter out, or will Moore's law continue on as it has? We're going to have some related questions on computer chess. Will at what level, or how long will it take till computers reach particular ratings? We have questions in computing theory, P not equal to NP, a bunch of particular mathematical questions that will be proven one or the other, presumably eventually. You can bet on the resolution of those. We have some questions on Bitcoin and what people are doing with that. Questions on physics and physics experiments and how they're likely to be resolved.
Sounds really interesting. Wow. So, what in terms of like Dagger, was there any particular examples of interesting questions that people made predictions about, and have they been correct or close to correct? Or is it too early to know?
Well, all of the questions that were in those markets, have almost all of them have resolved by now. So we certainly have a data set about forecast accuracy. But it's important to have a comparison. So some questions are easy and some are hard. And to evaluate any method of forecasting, you really need to evaluate it by comparison to some other method of forecasting. Just merely, I could ask whether the sun's going to come up every day, and then I can get a track record over 1,000 days, and I'd be right every day out of 1,000. And you wouldn't necessarily think my forecasting method was very impressive because it's an easy question. And you might ask about when the next, next quarter is going to be a recession, and I might spend millions of dollars with all the world's experts, and I still might get a pretty low accuracy because it might just be a really hard question, which way the economy is going to go. So you want to judge these things by comparison. So within the project, we had several different teams, and they were each using different methods, and that was helps you compare. Unfortunately, we didn't control the quality of participants, so I think some of the teams just had access to better participants.
Hmm.
In terms of the main thing that makes a difference in forecasting is having good people who pay attention to the questions that they're asked. There's no clever mathematical way to munge people's to massage people's forecast to turn lead into gold. If you don't start with somebody who's smart and paying attention and thinking about a question.
So how can we attract smart people who bias them to think about the questions carefully? How do we do that? I mean, what I guess these projects that you're doing are great examples of perhaps how to do that. But in an abstract sense, what
So yeah,
do you
these
think we can
projects
do?
aren't going to necessarily induce great effort.
Really?
So because they're small projects and we're not giving our participants very strong incentives. I mean, they're more trials and demonstrations of feasibility. Um, I think it's interesting to compare the future and the past. So at some level, the future is more important than the past because we live in the future. We can do something about it. And the past is already gone. But the past has a well-respected large set of experts called historians, and they have whole departments at universities, and you can take degrees there. And they have a lot of interest and respect. There are many amateurs who like to read books about history, and many amateurs who write books about history. But most of those amateurs, respect the professional historians. They read about them, and they maybe even study with them. And even if they disagree with them, they'll think about what they have to say and respond to them. And that's really quite different from the future. So in the future, there are many people in the public interested in the future, almost as many as in the past, and that often includes prestigious, distinguished people, physicists, technology people, etc., who spend a life getting some other kind of expertise and then decide they want to focus on the future, and they write books about it or give talks about it. But there's much less professionalism in the sense that although there are some academic futurists who specialize in the future, there are far fewer than historians, and they aren't very well respected. And so when a physicist or a technology expert decides to focus on the future, they don't pay that much attention to the professional futurists. They don't read what they have to say or think about responding to them or go study with them. They usually just start all over from scratch and try to figure it all out for themselves. Which is a problem because it means that the field doesn't become professional and accumulate. It doesn't work together and build up insight and develop methods.
Mm-hmm.
It's more a lot of one-off amateurs
Mm.
who obviously are smart and capable, but they haven't spent their life studying that. They add a few years at some later point of jumping into it because they're interested.
Mm.
And even if you're really smart, that's just no substitute for a lifetime of focus and professionalism in that expertise.
Mm.
So,
Mm.
um, what would most help for the future, a better understanding of the world, of the future, would be for there to be a professional community who, like historians, spend their lives as futurists,
Mm.
just like historians spend their lives as historians,
Mm.
and who accumulate a community of practice and methods such that they talk to each other and evaluate each other and criticize each other
Mm.
and become, you know, build up a body of knowledge about the future.
Mm.
And certainly that's possible, but it hasn't happened.
Mm. So you mentioned recently that actually you said, I'll quote you, academic futurism has low status. This causes people interested in futurism to ignore the academics and instead listen to people who talk about futurism after having a high status via focusing on other topics. As a result, the people who are listened to on the future tend to be amateurs, not specialists, and this is why we know a lot less about the future than we could. So, okay, so academic futurism has low status. Why is that the case? Are they tainted by non-professional futurists making stabs at the future and getting it all wrong?
Well, there are a number of plausible explanations, and I'm not sure how much weight to give each one of them.
Hmm.
The explanation you just identified is one of the plausible contributions. That is, say on subjects like aliens or sex. These have long been subjects that ordinary people have been interested in, but they are also subjects that academics stayed away from, and they stayed away from them plausibly in part because they didn't want to be confused for those amateurs who were so enthusiastically interested in talking about those subjects. They needed to find an academic way to be different about the subjects. And
Hmm.
so academics could only really study aliens when they could have radio telescopes and like do it in a way that clearly the other alien fans couldn't do. Or even about sex, they had to not study sex by the usual way of like doing it and talking about it. They had to study sex by like putting people in a room and sitting behind a window and watching and writing down what happened and being very different in how they studied it.
Hmm.
And so certainly, there is a problem when a subject is too interesting and there are too many sloppy, enthusiastic amateurs who are attending to the subject, then that puts off academics because they are afraid of being confused for those.
Hmm.
And they need to find a very different way to approach it. And so that's also in part true for futurists who now, if they're a professional, have to be very different toward the future than the amateurs in order to show that have a different attitude.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
but there's also just lots of other random factors. That is, academia doesn't spread itself evenly out across all interesting subjects. It clumps.
Hmm.
Academia is famously clumps because each academic wants to stay near other academics in order to be evaluated by them and to reaffirm that they're all really good. And so academics clump into groups who are each willing to say those other guys are doing good stuff because they're doing stuff just like me, and I cite them and they cite me.
Hmm.
And so that means they leave a lot of empty territory, a lot of topics that they don't cover much because they haven't been covering much lately. And any one person who went out there to cover it all by himself is all by themselves and at risk of other people saying, well, that's no good work and I don't understand it and doesn't look important and reject their papers,
Hmm. Hmm.
reject their grant applications. So there's a lot of randomness in what academia covers.
Hmm. Which is a shame. I mean, if we had enough people, then the random scattering would cover probably a lot more points, and perhaps
Well,
we'd
it's
convergence.
clumpy. That's the point.
Mm.
If they were evenly spread, then there'd be somebody near everything.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. If there was enough,
Well,
if there were enough scatters, but yeah, it seems as though
right.
they're clumping a bit. What areas do you think would be very useful to clump towards, or what area is deficient in futurology or forecasting need more attention?
Well, so I've always expressed it as academic fields academia has trouble combining the non-newspaper versions of different fields. So in each field, academics know about the newspaper version of their field, and then they know their expert versions. So in economics or computing or physics, um, and each academia reads the newspaper version of other fields, and they tend to believe the newspaper version of other fields, the simple media version, but they know the expert version of their own field.
Mm.
But if a particular subject needs to combine non-newspaper versions of two different fields, then in each field they think it can't be right. So for example, there'd be technology, computer as a field or economics as a field.
Mm.
And so economists know that the newspaper version of economics isn't right, and they know the specialty version, but computer scientists believe the newspaper version of economics,
Mm.
and vice versa. Economists believe the newspaper version of computers, but they don't know and believe the specialty computer scientist view of computers. So
Mm.
if you want to combine, say, what the specialist computers say future computers would be like with what the specialists in economics say economics is like, well, then each side says that can't be right.
Yeah, well, maybe we need specialists that cover both areas really well. I mean, maybe people need
Where
to go to
each
school for longer.
those specialists would be rejected by the specialists in each of the particular fields
Mm. Mm.
because they're saying something that goes against the newspaper version of the other fields they know about. So
Mm.
that's a problem in futurism. So I think one of the things futurism needs is people who combine knowing sort of basic social science, which many futurists do,
Mhm.
with also knowing sort of basic projections of where particular technologies are likely to go, which many technologists are likely to do. But unfortunately, when you talk to the sort of straightforward standard social scientists about the technology projections, they go, "Oh, that's all science fiction fantasy."
Mm.
And when you talk to the technologists about standard social science, they say, "Well, that's all capitalism or you know something that doesn't. That's not the way they think societies work because they don't know how societies work, but they think they do."
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so that's what I offer. But it's an example of the more general phenomena. Academia does just neglects the intersections of the expert views of different fields.
Mm. Sure. It sounds. I think MIT underdog Norbert Weiner in the late '40s had a lot to say about that. But I'll leave that to another discussion. There's a conference coming up. Did you hear about the Norbert Weiner conference in
No,
Massachusetts? Okay, I'll send you some information. It'll be cool. I think James Hughes will be going, who's a sociologist. We mentioned
yeah,
sociologists. Yeah, so that'll be good. Also, look, we were meant to cover Future Day, so sorry, all you Future Day enthusiasts, it's taken so long to get round to this wonderful topic. I wanted to broach you and ask you, can Future Day help improve the economy of attention on the future? If so, can that actually help strategic forecasting, making better forecasts? And how do we improve the likelihood of that actually occurring using Future Day as a tool?
right. So I mean, a lot will depend on how future day is framed.
Mm.
So many people are familiar with, say, going to movies and science fiction stories about the future. So the future isn't alien as a place in people's awareness or cognition. It's part of where fantasy stories are told.
Mhm.
It's a standard place for fantasy stories, just like the Old West or Under the Sea or in the Himalayas or something. It's just a standard place for adventure and fantasy stories to be told. And so, if Future Day just becomes a day to sort of remember Star Wars and Buck Rogers and all of the futures we've known and loved, I'm not sure how much of a difference it would make.
Mhm.
Just reaffirming the idea that it's a fantasy land where fantastic things happen and
Mhm.
all the rules of fantasy fiction apply.
Mhm. Pixie dust.
Um, Right. If it's instead framed as, a real place where like real choices are made and affected and where real live constraints apply, where you can't have everything you want and it's not all about fun and adventure, then it might have a better chance of focusing people's attention on something that matters.
Mhm.
But people are somewhat reluctant to frame the future that way, and especially if it's a holiday. Well, it's kind of a buzzkill to like bring all sorts of serious,
Mhm.
dire, down things on a holiday. Holidays are about fun, so you know,
Mhm.
I can imagine a future day if you wear costumes, you might wear a Buck Rogers costume or a Star Wars costume, or if you give gifts, you'll give somebody a Tang packet or something, and you could make it fun of it.
Mhm.
So a holiday that was just more about the symbolism and the fun of futuristic images would probably tend to move more in the direction of famous movies about the fiction future, or sort of famous futuristic forecasts
Hmm.
that are sort of fun. Like people might wear a jetpack on Future Day because the future was always about the place where we had jetpacks, right?
Yeah, that's right. They're very
Um,
dangerous, so I wouldn't recommend people to do that. I don't want people
right,
dying
but,
on the
but it's still
future.
an iconic image of the future. It's still a thing that the future has,
Hmm. Hmm. Definitely.
and moon colonies or something like that. So
Yeah, I mean, lots of people have their fetishes about, what their favorite sci-fi movies, or some sort of vogue model of what it would be like to live in the future, and people play that out. But yeah, I agree with you. If Future Day is going to do anything important, then maybe we need to focus on how we can improve our models of the future and how we can bias the likelihood in general of better futures. It's just a matter of how
right.
to do that.
So Memorial Day might be more of an example.
Hmm.
So Memorial Day isn't a day to wear silly costumes and do silly things.
Hmm.
It's supposed to be more of a somber, serious sort of
Hmm.
remembrance of things that are important.
Hmm. Do you remember
Um,
the future?
right. So that's harder to do.
Hmm.
So the question is, can you sort of create an aura of seriousness
Hmm.
about something without these concrete, specific things to honor or remember?
Hmm. In terms of getting some form of critical mass, so that it's a recognised sort of day. You know, I'm a bit sort of worried about just focusing on just memorial, although I reckon that's a great idea. I mean, like, if people want to use it to have fun and have a party, that's fantastic. It means more people get involved and the meme may spread further. But there's also, if people want to use it in business as a day to make forecasts about where a particular product line will be in the next like 12 months, or where the business will be in 5 years, then that's fine. Boardroom meetings are fine,
Yeah.
a good location for a future
I
day event.
I think it would be great if there was a standard day in which, say, pundits' forecasts were scored for accuracy.
Yeah, yeah, yep.
Um, so that would. Unfortunately, I was told that like a major Washington area media outlet like did a study for several months where they tried to go over pundits of various sorts forecasts and score them for accuracy, and then the project was killed because people decided, well, their readers don't really want to know that their pundits aren't so accurate,
Hmm.
and that would say discourage people from reading these pundits, and that
Hmm.
would take away from their revenue and customers.
Hmm.
So it's not clear that customers of pundits want to find out that in fact the most popular articulate pundits they most enjoy reading are not in fact any more accurate than the others.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and so
Yeah,
it's not clear there's
it's
demand
gloomy.
for this.
Do gloomy memes spread? you know, how do you spread a gloomy meme telling everybody that they're wrong? You know, I mean, actually, maybe it's a good way to spread a meme. Just tell people that they're wrong, and the people who hate the people who are wrong can spread the meme for them, right? That I don't know.
Right. So at the moment, like New Year's Day is often a time for review of the previous year and
Yes,
some
that's right.
area element of prediction of the
Hmm.
next year, although it's not so much of a retrospective evaluation of the last year's predictions.
Hmm. Hmm. But
That would be useful.
yeah, that would be. Often people make New Year's resolutions. It'd be interesting if Future Day could be used to evaluate how those resolutions are going, since there's been, a couple of months to
Right.
see how well they're doing. Yeah, yeah. Did you make
Right.
any
Well, yeah,
New Year's
I mean, I think
resolutions
it's
this year?
it's it's noteworthy that like most organizations, even businesses, when they
Mm.
have meetings, those meetings are constantly implicitly around various kinds of forecasts. What happens if we add more budget to this project? What happens if we put this guy in here? What happens if we do an ad campaign? But
Mm.
they almost never do retrospective analyses of previous meetings and whether they were who said what and who was right.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
So there's actually relatively low taste or interest in
Mm.
doing retrospective accuracy analyses in most social and business contexts.
Mm. Right. Yeah, it'd be awesome to be able to. What you said before, actually, it's been sort of. It'd be awesome to have some sort of a scorecard facility. By 2014, anybody who's made a prediction about this particular date or around this time, how close have they been? Who's been right and who's been particularly wrong. I think that would be particularly interesting. Yeah, yeah.
So how are we doing on time here?
Well, I think we've pretty much covered all the topics that we intended to. So if there's any
Okay.
concluding remarks that you'd like to make, then yeah, this is the time to do it.
Well, I've been working on a book for the last year or two where I've
Excellent.
been trying to focus on a very particular future topic, which is the social implications of brain emulations. And I have to admit, I have not been a futurist for most of my professional life, but I've been trying to become a focused specialist on this topic
Right.
and to read as many other experts who have spoken on related topics as possible and build on what other people have said. So I try not to be just a one-off amateur
Mm,
who sort of spins off his own approach without building on the work of others.
mm,
And so I'm going to try to fix the mistake and
mm,
avoid the mistakes that I've complained about,
mm.
and also try to produce institutions where people make forecasts with numbers and can be scored later for accuracy, and
Excellent.
to hold themselves up to a higher standard.
Fantastic. And what's this book going to be called?
Well, at the moment, my draft title was "After the Dream Time,"
Yeah.
uh, an allusion to this our current era being something of a dream time.
Sure.
But it's about the whole brain emulation and the kinds of society and it would produce.
Okay. Awesome. When do you expect it to be out?
I'm still working on it, so
Yeah.
we're not
Yeah.
at that point.
Okay. All right. That's cool. Well, it's been fantastic speaking to you.
Great talking to
And
you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, I'm looking forward to yeah, Future Day, and everybody who wants to get involved should contact us and let us know what you
Well,
want
let's
to do.
just say Happy Future Day, Adam.
Happy Future Day. Cool. Thanks, Robin.
Take care.
Cheers.